So, a few weeks ago, it was announced that the Brickyard 400 held at the popular Indianapolis Oval would be returning to the NASCAR schedule in 2024 for the first time since 2020, after a few years of the series racing on the road course for the IndyCar NASCAR crossover event. The reaction on social media to this news was positive, as people were begging for this event to return, as they felt that the IndyCar/NASCAR crossover event that took its place wasn't as good as the organisers of NASCAR, IndyCar and even Indianapolis itself was expecting. Even the fans that hoped the event would be good were left disappointed. However, my reaction to this was a bit perplexed, given the last time the event was held, it didn't have a great attendance record. In fact, the event hadn't had a good attendance record for a number of years, and that in large is contributed to one year in particular, with many people branding it as the race that killed the Brickyard 400. This is the story of one of the most controversial NASCAR races of all time, the 2008 Brickyard 400. June 2005, round 9 of the 2005 Formula 1 World Championship. And for anyone wondering why I'm bringing up an F1 race in a video talking about NASCAR, bear with me, this does have some relevance to the topic we are talking about. The race would take place at Indianapolis, obviously, and it would end up becoming the most farcical Formula 1 race of all time. More farcical in my opinion than the 2021 Belgian Grand Prix, as unlike that race, the events that transpired in this were completely avoidable. Throughout the weekend, there were concerns surrounding the Michelin tyres, ran by 7 of the 10 Formula 1 teams competing that season. During Friday free practice, Toyota's free practice driver Ricardo Zonta suffered a blowout to the rear right tyre, ending his session immediately. At the time, no one thought anything of it, as it seemed to be a normal blowout. However, later in the session, Toyota's main driver Ralf Schumacher ended up having a similar blowout, this time at the fast turn 13 banking. What makes the accident strange is that Ralf had a similar accident the previous season when he was driving for Williams, which put him out of action for 6 races. As a precaution from the medical staff at the circuit, Ralf withdrew for the rest of the weekend, replaced by free practice driver Ricardo Zonta. But again, another blowout for a Toyota. Surely a coincidence, right? Well, no. After that free practice session came to a close, Michelin did tests on all of its teams' tyres, including Toyota, and it emerged that all the other Michelin teams, which were BAR, Renault, Williams, McLaren, Sauber and Red Bull, also had tyres that were on the brink of blowing up. After finding out this information, Michelin did testing on the tyres that hadn't been used yet and found that the tyres would only do around 10 to 15 laps before they failed. And given that this season had a rule that prevented teams from changing tyres during a pit stop, except if their car had a puncture or if the weather conditions had changed, this was a huge problem. Michelin shipped over a different batch of tyres, specifically ones that were used at the Spanish Grand Prix earlier that season, to see if that would solve the problem. However, they were prevented from doing this by the FIA, as the rule stated that a tyre manufacturer could not change the specification of tyres during a weekend for whatever reason. It was later discovered that even if Michelin were allowed to use those batch of tyres, the tyres that they had shipped would also have the same issue. After Michelin wrote a letter to the FIA saying they couldn't guarantee that their tyres would last the full race distance, meetings were held to try and find a solution to ensure that all the Michelin teams were able to race safely against the Bridgestone runners, who themselves had reported no issues with their tyres. Initial solutions included allowing the race to have tyre changes, to even allowing the Michelin runners to run Bridgestone tyres, as according to Minardi team owner and principal Paul Stoddard, he claimed that a Bridgestone employee who was at the circuit for the Grand Prix had told them that they had enough tyres to supply all the 10 teams for the race. These suggestions were shot down for sporting and contractual reasons, so instead the main reason that was put forward to the FIA was to have a temporary chicane between turns 11 and 13 to not only slow the cars down, but also to ensure that there wasn't a lot of load being put on the tyres when they arrived at the banked final corner. 9 of the 10 teams agreed to have a chicane put in place, with Ferrari the only team not agreeing to this. And because this was during a time where all the teams had to agree, rather than a huge majority, the FIA refused to build one, with the FIA president at the time, Max Mosley, who was not at the event, threatening the teams if they did so. Despite protests from the teams that they would refuse to go out of the pit lane should a chicane not be built, all 10 teams made their way out onto the grid. The cars made their way around the formation lap, only for the 7 Michelin teams to pull into the pit lane and withdraw from the race on safety grounds, leaving just the 6 cars on Bridgestone tyres to race without them. The fans ended up booing throughout the race, which was won by Michael Schumacher, even going as far as to throwing bottles and cans at the circuit to show their disgust. Formula 1 would race a further 2 years at Indianapolis to honour the contract the circuit had, with F1 not returning to the Brickyard from 2008, with F1 not having a US GP until 2012 when the GP moved to COTA. Throughout the Indianapolis Motor Speedway's lifespan, this is the one stain that has been left on the circuit's long history. That was until what happened in 2008. The Brickyard 400 would play host to round 20 of the 2008 NASCAR Cup Series, and including this race, there were only 7 races to go before what was dubbed the chase for the Sprint Cup, as this was during a time before the stupid playoff system was implemented, which is one of the many reasons why I'm not an avid follower of NASCAR anymore. That and the stupid stage points during races. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. Going into this race, Joe Gibbs Racing's Carl Busch was the man to beat, as he came into this race with a 262-point lead ahead of Dale Earnhardt Jr., having achieved 12 top 5 finishes, 2 pole positions, and a whopping 7 wins, which came at Atlanta, Talladega, Darlington, Dover, Sonoma, and the 2 previous races, which were the Coke Zero 400 at Daytona and the LifeLock.com 400 at Chicagoland. For this race, Carl qualified in 7th place, with his nearest rival Dale Jr. starting down in P11, 2 places in front of ex-F1 driver Juan Pablo Montoya. Reigning champion Jimmie Johnson started from pole position ahead of Mark Martin in 2nd and Ryan Newman in 3rd. The race was scheduled for 160 laps, which is equivalent to 400 miles obviously. However, before the race began, there was concerns about the race itself. During pre-race practice, it became clear that the specification of tyres that they were using for the Brickyard 400 were wearing out extremely quickly. This in large was down to the surface of the track, given how abrasive the diamond cut surface that the circuit used was, sounding familiar to you guys, and the fact that the car regulations for NASCAR at the time, which was dubbed the Car of Tomorrow, had never ran around Indianapolis before, and it was believed that the car was more abrasive on its tyres than what the previous car was. The concerns became so overwhelming that it led to the NASCAR officials to implement competition cautions for the race, like at the 1969 Talladega 500, and they would come out every 10 to 12 laps to give the teams a chance to change tyres so that they wouldn't blow out, with Pocono spec tyres, which were meant to be used for the following weekend, being used as backup tyres in case any of the teams ran out. Sounds familiar to the Formula 1 race that happened recently in Qatar. In doing this, they hoped that the track would rubber in to the point where the tyres wouldn't wear out as much, and that they wouldn't need to throw competition cautions anymore during the race. The race started and Jimmie Johnson got off to a lightning start, leaving Mark Martin behind, with teammate Jeff Gordon moving up to 3rd by the end of the first lap. However, after only 4 laps, the caution came out, but not because of tyre issues. Instead, it was due to the number 55 of Michael Waltrip losing the back end at turn 2 whilst battling with the number 77 of Sam Hornish Jr. and tagging the side of the number 15 of Paul Menard. Because the caution had come out quite early, some drivers took the opportunity to pit for fresh rubber. The race would get going again on lap 10, with Jimmie Johnson still leading, this time in front of his teammate Jeff Gordon. However, after another 4 laps, another caution would come out, this time involving Kurt Busch, older brother of Kyle, losing the back end and taking Kevin Harvick with him. And given 10 to 12 laps had already been passed, this was declared as a competition caution, with the drivers who didn't pit during the first caution period, which included the leaders, having to pit this time around. This in turn allowed Dale Earnhardt Jr., who pitted during the first caution, to take the lead at the restart, which was on lap 18. Teams at this point were starting to see improvement. However, with the drivers still having cording issues, which was what Lewis Hamilton had at the 2007 Chinese Grand Prix, that ultimately cost him his first world title, the concerns were still there. And those concerns would come true when 8 laps later, Dale Earnhardt Jr. would become the first driver to suffer a blowout in the race, ending any chance he had of competing for the win. Then, 3 laps later, Juan Pablo Montoya, having been at the centre of the 2005 US Grand Prix, also suffered a blowout, this time bringing out the second competition caution. Then, as the race progressed, it was becoming clear that these competition cautions were not working, as more drivers would suffer issues with their tyres. Jeff Gordon was reported to have cording issues with his tyres after Montoya's blowout. Carl Edwards would also report the same on lap 47, and at the same time, Matt Kenseth would also have a blowout, similar to Dale Jr. and Juan Montoya. This led to a grand total of 11 cautions, 9 of which being competition cautions. The only other one not to involve a competition caution was when Brian Vickers' Toyota had an engine failure. Because of how bad the degradation was, it meant that the drivers had to reduce their speeds in order to get to the next competition caution. At the final caution period, the race became a shootout between Jimmy Johnson and Carl Edwards, which was eventually won by Jimmy Johnson, essentially converting his pole into the win. The race in turn would play a crucial part in Jimmy Johnson winning his third title come season's end, despite the strong season Kyle Busch had up until this point. The repercussions that were left by this event were clear to see. The NASCAR vice president at the time, Robin Pemberton, apologised to all the fans a couple of days later for the race that transpired at the event. In order to rectify this, Goodyear, the tyre suppliers for NASCAR, ran several tests at the circuit to find out what the cause of these issues were, which concluded to be an increased amount of load, which led to only small particles being produced, preventing the track from being rubbered in quick enough, and also to find a solution to ensure the 2009 running of the Brickyard 400 didn't have the same issues. However, despite this, the damage that was left by this race had already been done. When the race made its debut in 1994, capitalising on the success the Indy 500 had, the race had a sold-out crowd, which it would continue to have up until that infamous race. From 2009, the crowd attendance would continue to deplete in size. NASCAR and even Indianapolis themselves tried to find ways to bring the attendance figures back up. This included moving the race to a Saturday, having it moved to being the final race of the normal season before the chase, and even going as far as to staging the race on July the 4th during American Independence Day as a form of patriotism. However, despite these attempts, it didn't work, and after the 2020 edition of the Brickyard 400, which only saw 50,000 people attend due to the pandemic, and saw it cross over with IndyCar's race at the road course, the event was scrapped from 2021 and replaced with the Verizon 200 at the road course layout of Indianapolis, once again crossing over with IndyCar. They would continue to do this event until the end of 2023, when it was announced after the crossover event had been scrapped and that IndyCar would be returning to the Milwaukee Mile for a doubleheader, that the Brickyard 400 would be making its return in 2024, returning to the oval layout. And now we arrive back at the present day, and we have to ask ourselves this: will the Brickyard 400 be successful this time around? Honestly, I really don't know. Sure, it might produce a sellout crowd in 2024, given the positive reaction it got when it was announced that it would be returning, but say they do have a sellout crowd next year, can they maintain that in the next few years or so, or will the memories of 2008 still linger and end up being a huge flop again like last time? Like with many things, only time will tell, I guess.